the mistress who wanted everything, an affair that turned tragic, criminal story. Pauline had spent the last 5 years living in the quiet chaos of a secret life. On the outside, she was a woman of impeccable poise, well-educated, well-dressed, and admired by all who knew her. She had a thriving career in the competitive world of fashion, a circle of influential friends, and the sort of life most women would envy. Her apartment was an elegant reflection of her taste, sleek, modern, with a touch of understated luxury that conveyed both sophistication and the quiet assurance that she had worked hard to build everything she had. She had everything anyone could want, or so it appeared. Before we can continue, if you love crime stories, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. But beneath the polished surface, there was a truth that only Pauline herself truly knew. A truth she could never speak aloud, not to anyone, not even to herself, at least not in the way it needed to be said. For the past 5 years, she had been involved in a secret affair with Henry. He was married, and he had children. He was everything she wasn't supposed to want, and yet everything she couldn't seem to walk away from. He had first entered her life during an event for the launch of a new clothing line she had been working on. Henry, a successful businessman, was there as part of a corporate sponsorship. Their initial encounter had been fleeting, a conversation across the bar over shared drinks, but the chemistry between them had been electric, undeniable. Henry was charming, easy to talk to, and had an air of self-assured confidence that Pauline found irresistibly attractive. Their connection deepened quickly. What had started as a casual flirtation turned into a more intense, secretive relationship. Pauline knew it was wrong, that it was dangerous. But in the beginning, she allowed herself to believe that the attraction was worth the risk. It was just one affair, one passionate distraction. And besides, Henry had promised her he would leave his wife eventually. He had told her that their marriage was on the rocks, that he was unhappy, that his wife was cold and indifferent. Pauline, caught in the allure of the forbidden, believed him. She believed that the promise of someday would eventually turn into the reality of being his only love, his one and only. At first, it had been exciting, sneaking around, meeting in dimly lit hotels, exchanging glances in crowded rooms when no one was looking. They shared stolen kisses in the back of darkened restaurants, whispered sweet words late at night when Henry called her. And despite the secrecy and the constant fear of being found out, Pauline felt a rush she had never experienced before. To be desired by a man like Henry felt like a validation of everything she had ever wanted. To be the woman he sought after, the one he would leave everything behind for, this was the pinnacle of her desires. It gave her a sense of power, a sense of being seen in ways that her other relationships never had. But as the months turned into years, something changed. Pauline's expectations, once so fluid and flexible, became rigid. She began to resent Henry's inaction. She found herself growing impatient as each promise of soon or when the time is right wore thin. Henry was stuck, caught in his own web of lies. He told her that he couldn't risk his children, that his wife was going through a difficult period, that they were working on it. Every excuse felt like another layer of denial, another rejection wrapped in the guise of concern for his family. And that was where the rot began to settle. The excitement that had once defined their meetings began to lose its luster. What had been an exhilarating love affair, a seductive dance between desire and danger, slowly turned into something that gnawed at Pauline's insides. The waiting, the secrecy, the lies, they were no longer just a temporary inconvenience. They had become the structure of her life. She felt herself changing, becoming more desperate, more willing to accept anything that would assure her that Henry's promises were true. What had begun as a relationship based on passion now felt more like a trap. The guilt was overwhelming, gnawing at her conscience at all hours of the day. Every time she looked at her reflection, she saw a woman who was no longer the person she had once been. The sharp, successful businesswoman was being overshadowed by the woman who lived in fear of being exposed, fear of rejection, and perhaps most painfully, fear of not being enough. But even more than that, she was terrified of being ordinary, of being another woman he had lied to. Henry's wife, despite all the complaints and criticisms Pauline had heard over the years, remained a steadfast figure in Henry's life. He had convinced Pauline that his marriage was a sham, but she had come to realize something far worse, that he was not going to leave his wife, not now, not ever. In the quiet hours of the night, when her phone would buzz with a message from him, another excuse, another reason why he couldn't leave yet, Pauline would lie awake, staring at the ceiling. She knew she was clinging to something that was never hers to begin with, and yet, she couldn't let go. She had invested too much of herself into this affair. She had sunk too deeply into the illusion of a future that, at this point, seemed both elusive and unattainable. Her friends, her family, no one knew. Pauline had carefully curated the life she wanted the world to see. She had managed to keep the affair a secret, painting herself as the quintessential image of a successful woman. But inwardly, she was crumbling. No one understood the sacrifices she had made, the quiet loneliness that seeped into her every waking moment. She felt like a ghost in her own life, alive, but disconnected from everything real. But Pauline's greatest torment was this. She wasn't just angry at Henry. She was angry at herself. Angry for allowing herself to become someone she never thought she would be. Someone so obsessed with someone else's love that she had lost sight of her own worth. She had built her identity around the idea of being chosen, of being loved, of finally being the one who would break free of the restrictions of her ordinary life. But in doing so, she had allowed herself to become complicit in her own misery. She was trapped by her own desires. As much as she tried to deny it, a part of her had known, deep down, that this would never end the way she had imagined. Henry had given her fleeting moments of joy, but they were never enough. He had promised to leave his wife so many times, and each time, the promise had unraveled. Every time he made an excuse, Pauline's hope was chipped away, piece by piece. The truth was simple but devastating. She had allowed herself to become entangled in a love that was never hers to possess. And she knew that if she didn't break free, she would lose herself entirely. But that breaking point was a long time coming. It wasn't one single moment. It was a series of small, cumulative events that pushed Pauline to the edge. The endless cycles of hope and disappointment, the gut-wrenching realization that Henry was never going to leave his wife, the feeling that her life was slipping through her fingers, that time was running out, all led her to one inescapable conclusion. She couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when inside, she was falling apart. The breaking point arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the first crack in the surface of a glass that had been too tightly compressed. Pauline realized that she had spent so much time fighting for Henry, fighting to make him choose her, that she had forgotten how to fight for herself. And that realization would set in motion a chain of events that would unravel her entire world. By this time, Henry had become less of a lover and more of an anchor, one that held her in place as she slowly suffocated. She had become someone she barely recognized, desperate, obsessive, bitter. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Pauline could feel herself slipping further and further into a darkness she didn't know how to escape. But she wasn't ready to let go of Henry yet. She couldn't. Not when everything she had built in her mind, the dreams, the hopes, the future, was teetering on the edge of collapse. She needed him. She needed him to finally choose her. But what would happen when the man who had promised her the world could never deliver? What would happen when the fantasy she had created for herself was shattered by the stark, cold truth? Pauline would soon learn the terrible consequences of wanting something too much, of wanting to possess something that was never truly hers to begin with. And it all began with a decision, one that would change everything. The days leading up to that pivotal moment were marked by an escalating sense of unease that Pauline couldn't shake. It wasn't just the usual feelings of jealousy, frustration, and longing that had become all too familiar. It was something darker, more insidious. The quiet ache in her chest had turned into a gnawing, persistent hunger for a future that Henry had promised but never delivered. She had been patient for years, believing that each excuse, Each delay was a temporary obstacle on the road to the life they were meant to share. But slowly, that patience had eroded, and what remained was a simmering rage that she could no longer contain. It started as a small irritation, an uncomfortable niggle at the back of her mind. At first, it was just Henry's absence that hurt, the phone calls that became less frequent, the half-hearted messages that seemed to hold more of the same empty reassurances than real emotion. Then it was his excuses. There was always something. "The kids are going through a tough time," he would say. "I don't want to tear my family apart," he would add, and she would nod, silently understanding that the truth was far more complicated than the fairy tale she had built in her mind. Every promise to leave his wife seemed to dissolve into the ether the moment he stepped back into the reality of his family life. But it wasn't just the absence of action. It was the shift in his demeanor that really began to wear at her. His voice no longer held the same passion when they spoke late into the night. The plans they'd made, the quiet promises they'd shared about starting over, began to feel more like distant fantasies than something that could ever come to pass. Each time he kissed her goodbye, there was a hesitation, an almost imperceptible distance between them that made her heart ache. He no longer looked at her the way he once did, with that familiar gleam in his eye that had once made her feel like she was the only woman in the world. Now, when he touched her, it felt like a duty, a mere extension of his ongoing charade. Pauline knew what was happening. She had seen the signs before, but she had refused to acknowledge them, buried the truth under layers of hope and denial. Henry's love for her had always been a fantasy, an illusion that she had woven herself into, desperately holding on to a dream that seemed to slip further from her grasp with every passing day. And now, with the passage of time, she could no longer ignore the reality that Henry wasn't going to leave his wife. He had made that clear. His words, "I can't risk my family," echoed in her ears every time she lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had gone wrong, wondering why she wasn't enough. But Pauline was not the type of woman who simply accepted defeat. She had always fought for what she wanted, and this was no different. She had given him years of her life, invested so much of herself into this affair, and she wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. She couldn't. Her mind raced with thoughts of what she might have to do to get what she wanted, to finally get Henry to choose her. But she had to act fast. Time, she felt, was running out. She was no longer willing to wait passively for him to make a decision. If Henry wasn't going to leave his wife willingly, then Pauline would force him to. She would not stand by while he lived his life, content with his family and his stable existence, while she continued to wither away in the shadows of his love. That evening, when the call came, she was already prepared. Henry had texted earlier in the day, as he always did. The message was simple, yet it carried the same hollow tone it always did. "Can we talk tonight?" The words were familiar, almost ritualistic now. But Pauline wasn't fooled anymore. She knew this conversation would be like all the others, polite, unassuming, and ultimately unsatisfying. Henry would tell her how much he cared, but he would follow it with another excuse, another reason why he couldn't leave his family, why he couldn't give her the life she wanted. She could feel the knot in her stomach tighten as she read the message again. At that moment, she made a decision. She would no longer allow him to control the narrative of their relationship. She would stop waiting for Henry to act, and she would make him make a choice. This was no longer about love. It was about power, about reclaiming control over a situation that had long since slipped through her fingers. She called him, her voice steady despite the roiling emotions that churned inside her. "You need to come to my apartment tonight," she said, the words coming out of her mouth with a confidence she didn't feel. "We need to talk about everything. It's time." Henry hesitated on the other end, and for a brief moment, Pauline thought he might resist. But then he agreed. He always did. That night, when he arrived at her apartment, Pauline had already begun to feel the weight of her decision settle in. The apartment, always immaculate, seemed to press in on her. The clean lines of the furniture, the soft, muted lighting, the distant hum of the city outside, everything seemed too perfect, too constructed. It made her feel small, insignificant. And in that moment, She wanted to tear it all down, break everything into pieces, and start again. She was ready to do anything to regain some sense of control over the life she had allowed Henry to dictate for far too long. Henry entered the apartment with his usual air of easygoing confidence, but when he saw the look in her eyes, something shifted. His smile faltered, and for the first time in months, Pauline saw a flicker of unease pass across his face. "Pauline, what's going on?" he asked, his tone cautious. She didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she walked past him, her footsteps deliberate and steady, and into the small office where they had shared so many of their whispered secrets. She closed the door behind her, and as she turned to face him, the truth that had been building inside her for so long came rushing out in a torrent. "I'm done waiting, Henry," she said, her voice low but unmistakably firm. "I'm done with your promises, with your lies. You've been telling me for years that you'll leave her, that we'll be together. But I'm starting to realize that I'm nothing more than your dirty little secret, your convenient escape when things aren't going well at home. I deserve more than that." Henry opened his mouth to speak, but she raised a hand, silencing him. "You need to make a choice," she continued, her voice rising with each word. "It's simple. Either you leave her and be with me, or I'll tell her everything. I'll tell your wife about us. I'll expose you for the liar you are." Henry's face paled, and he took a step back, his eyes flickering with panic. "Pauline, you don't mean that," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You're angry, and I understand that, but—" "No," she interrupted him sharply. "I'm not angry. I'm done being patient, Henry. I've waited for years, and nothing has changed. I won't wait any longer. You either make a choice, or I'll make one for you." For a moment, there was silence between them, thick and suffocating. Henry's gaze fell to the floor, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He was thinking, weighing his options, and Pauline could see the conflict in his eyes. But that didn't matter to her anymore. She was past caring whether he was conflicted or not. She had put everything on the line for him, and he had failed her. Now it was her turn to take control. "You're right," he said after a long pause, his voice strained. "But I can't just—" Pauline stepped closer, her eyes narrowing, her breath steady. "You can't or you won't, Henry, because I'm done being patient. I've given you everything, my time, my love, my trust. You owe me, and if you can't give me what I want, then I'll make sure the whole world knows the truth about us." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. She had reached the breaking point. This wasn't just about Henry anymore. This was about her reclaiming the life she had given up for him. She wasn't going to sit in the shadows any longer, waiting for a man who would never choose her. She wasn't going to be the other woman any longer. And then, as she stood there in the stillness of the office, a sudden, chilling thought ran through her mind. What if he says no? What if he chooses his family over her, once and for all? She had spent so much time imagining the life they could have together, a life that seemed just out of reach. But now, the possibility of losing him, and losing everything she had ever dreamed of, felt more real than ever. The choice was no longer in her hands. She had made her move. Now it was Henry's turn. For the first time in years, Pauline stood at the precipice of her own desires, staring into the unknown. The act of demanding a choice from Henry had been both liberating and terrifying. It wasn't just about the ultimatum she had issued. It was about stepping into a new reality, one that she wasn't sure she was fully prepared for. The moment the words left her mouth, she felt a shift within herself, as if she had crossed some invisible boundary between fantasy and reality. Her heart raced with a blend of excitement and dread. There was no going back now. Henry's reaction had been exactly what she expected, a mix of shock and disbelief. At first, he had recoiled, as if the very idea that she would threaten his carefully constructed life was beyond comprehension. He had tried to talk his way out of it, to downplay the severity of the situation, as if the years of empty promises hadn't already built up to this boiling point. But Pauline was no longer listening to his words. She was focused on the power that had shifted into her hands. For so long, she had been waiting for him to take the lead, to make the decisions, to finally free her from the confines of a love that existed only in stolen moments and whispered secrets. But now, she was the one who held the power. And for the first time in a long time, she felt an intoxicating sense of control. She had never imagined she would find herself here, standing face to face with Henry, demanding that he make a choice. But the reality of the situation was undeniable. She had drawn a line in the sand. Henry, who had once been the man she believed would sweep her away into a new life, was now standing across from her, his own world crumbling under the weight of her ultimatum. She could see the panic in his eyes, the nervous twitch in his hands as he reached for the glass of water on the table. He had always been the one to make decisions, to offer promises, to make her feel as though their future was just beyond the horizon. But now, the decision was hers to make, and she couldn't help but feel both the excitement and terror of that realization. Despite her outward calm, inside, Pauline was a storm of emotions. She had spent years wrapped in the fantasy of what life with Henry would look like. She had sacrificed so much, her time, her self-respect, her own happiness, for the hope that he would eventually choose her. But now, standing in front of him, she realized how much of her own life she had given up in pursuit of someone else's love. And for the first time, she questioned whether it had been worth it. When Henry had walked into her apartment that night, there was a clear tension between them, an undercurrent of something that neither of them could ignore. The familiar patterns of their relationship, one where he would try to placate her, assure her, calm her down with soothing words, were now completely disrupted. This time, there was no pretending, no avoiding the inevitable. It was a moment of reckoning for both of them. But more than that, it was a moment of reckoning for Pauline. The apartment felt suddenly too small, the walls closing in as she paced, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here, something she hadn't yet fully grasped. In a way, the confrontation with Henry was a mirror, showing her the parts of herself she had been avoiding, the parts that had allowed her to live in this distorted reality for so long. Now, she was looking at him and asking him to choose, but was it possible that she was the one who needed to choose? Was it possible that she was the one who needed to confront her own choices, her own dependencies? The intensity of her feelings was overwhelming. She wanted him to say the right thing, to finally admit that he was ready to leave his wife and build a life with her. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. The years of deceit, the lies they had both told themselves, had created a complex web that neither of them could easily untangle. For so long, they had danced around the truth. He had kept her in the shadows, and she had let herself be kept there. But now, in the glaring light of their confrontation, the truth was undeniable. Henry's hesitation was palpable, and as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, Pauline could feel the weight of his indecision pressing down on both of them. She had expected him to resist, to try and talk her out of it, to attempt to appease her with empty promises. But what she hadn't expected was the raw fear that flashed across his face. For the first time, she saw him not as the man who held all the answers, but as a man who was lost, caught in his own contradictions. He loved her, but he wasn't ready to leave his family. He had told her time and time again that he couldn't risk it all, that his children needed him, that he didn't want to destroy the life he had built with his wife. But now, standing before him, Pauline could see the cracks in that facade. She could see the way his gaze darted around the room, unable to meet her eyes for more than a second at a time. "Pauline," Henry's voice faltered, as if trying to find the right words, "this isn't just about you and me. There's more at stake here. My children, my wife. What do you expect me to do? Just walk away from everything?" Pauline's chest tightened. She had heard these words before, but tonight, they didn't seem like an excuse anymore. They felt like a prison, one that Henry had built around himself, one that she had been trapped into. The difference now was that Pauline no longer cared about his children, his wife, or the life he had built. All she cared about was the life she had given up for him, the dream she had abandoned in the hope that someday he would choose her. "I expect you to make a decision," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "Either you leave her, or I tell her everything." "The choice is yours, Henry." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. For a moment, there was silence, and Pauline could feel the weight of her ultimatum sinking in. It was a stark, uncomfortable silence, and for the first time in their relationship, she realized how utterly empty and fragile everything had been up until that point. Henry had never truly chosen her, and she had never truly asked for more. She had let herself live in the shadows of his affection, content with whatever crumbs he threw her way. But tonight, that had to end. Henry's eyes flickered with something that might have been panic, but it was quickly replaced by something darker, defensiveness, perhaps even anger. He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room, trying to process the situation. "You don't understand," he said, voice rising. "I can't just throw everything away. You think I want to hurt my children? You think I want to ruin everything I've worked for? I can't just leave her, Pauline. It's not that simple." Pauline's pulse quickened as she watched him. She saw the vulnerability in him now, the same vulnerability she had once found so alluring. But tonight, it only made her more resolute. "Then you need to make a choice," she repeated, her voice firm. "If you can't leave her, then I'm done with this. I'm done with you, and I'll make sure she knows everything." The tension between them thickened, and Henry's anger flared. "You wouldn't. You're bluffing." "I'm not bluffing," Pauline said, her voice cold and steady. The words felt like steel in her mouth. "You've been lying to me for years, Henry, telling me things will change, promising me that one day we'll be together. Well, I'm done with the lies. If you can't choose me, then I'll choose for both of us." For a moment, Henry stood still, the weight of her words settling around him. The silence stretched on, unbearable, thick with the tension of everything unsaid. And in that silence, Pauline felt something shift within herself. It was as if a veil had been lifted. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of losing Henry. She was afraid of losing herself. Henry turned away from her, his back rigid, as if he were gathering the strength to make his decision. Pauline watched him, her chest tight, unsure of what he would do. But she knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back. Whatever happened next, she was ready. Pauline's heartbeat thundered in her chest as she stood in the middle of her apartment, her mind racing with the weight of her ultimatum. Henry had left only an hour ago, his departure marked by a tense silence that hung heavily between them. Her words, those sharp, cutting demands, still reverberated in her ears, but she couldn't help but wonder if she had overplayed her hand. She had never imagined it would come to this, her, alone in her apartment, staring into the abyss of her own choices. The adrenaline of the confrontation had worn off, leaving behind only a deep, gnawing uncertainty. It was one thing to demand change, to assert her own needs after years of waiting in the shadows of Henry's life. But now, with Henry gone and the echoes of their argument fading into the emptiness of her apartment, the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She had pushed him to a point of no return. She had forced him to choose. But what if he chose his family? What if he walked away from her forever? Was she really prepared to lose him, to see everything she had sacrificed for him crumble away into nothingness? For so long, Pauline had been consumed by the hope that one day Henry would be hers. She had convinced herself that if she just waited long enough, he would eventually come to his senses and leave his wife. But now that she had taken control, now that she had called his bluff, she found herself standing at a precipice. She had no idea what would come next, whether Henry would give in to her demands or whether she had pushed him too far, too soon. The apartment, once a symbol of her quiet refuge, now felt like a cage. Every piece of furniture, every picture on the wall, seemed to mock her. The walls that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt oppressive, enclosing her in a space that seemed too small for the monumental decision she had just made. She walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. The streets, bathed in the pale light of the street lamps, seemed distant and cold. She wanted to escape, to run away from this crushing reality, but there was no escaping the situation she had created. Her mind replayed the conversation over and over, as if somehow the words would make more sense with each repetition. Henry's face had been a mixture of fear, anger, and disbelief. He had tried to argue, to explain himself, but she had held firm. There had been no room for negotiation. And yet, now that he was gone, she realized how vulnerable she had made herself. By demanding that he make a choice, she had put her own future in his hands. She had forced him into a corner. But what if he didn't choose her? What if he chose his family and walked away, leaving her with nothing but the ashes of her broken heart? Pauline sank down onto the couch, her head in her hands. She was overwhelmed with the enormity of the decision she had made. She had wanted to feel powerful, to feel like she was in control of her own fate. But now, all she felt was fear. Fear of losing Henry. Fear of losing the dream she had spent so many years building. Fear of the unknown. In the days that followed, Pauline found herself trapped in a cycle of anticipation and dread. She would replay the events of the night in her mind over and over, wondering if she had made the right decision. She would go through her phone, checking for any messages from Henry, even though she knew he hadn't texted her. The silence between them was deafening. Every time the phone buzzed, her heart would skip a beat, but it was never him. It was always someone else, friends, co-workers, acquaintances, reminding her that life was going on, even though everything in her world seemed frozen. The truth was, Pauline wasn't sure what she wanted anymore. In her mind, the idea of being with Henry had always been clear. He was her escape, her ticket out of the life she had built around him. She had always been the other woman, the mistress, the secret lover. But what did it really mean to be with Henry? She had never considered the consequences of their affair beyond the desire for him to leave his wife. But now that the possibility of losing him loomed larger than ever, she was forced to confront the reality of what she had asked for. And the reality was daunting. What would it mean for her to have Henry all to herself? Would he truly leave his family for her, or was she just another part of his life that he couldn't fully commit to? What did she even want from him? Was it love, or was it the idea of love? Pauline began to wonder if she had spent so long fantasizing about their future together that she had never truly stopped to consider who Henry was beyond the man who promised her a life together. She had built him up into something more than he was, something he might never be. The reality of Henry, the man with a family, the man who had so much to lose, was starting to collide with the fantasy she had created in her mind. The more Pauline thought about it, the more she realized that she had never fully understood what Henry's world was like. She had seen only the parts of him that fit her narrative, the lover who would come to her when things weren't going well at home, the man who would kiss her with passion and promise her the world in quiet whispers. But she had never seen the other side of him, the man who had a family, a history, a responsibility that ran deeper than anything she could offer. She had always told herself that he would leave his wife for her, that eventually their love would win out. But now that she had forced him into a corner, she wasn't so sure. As the days passed, the silence grew louder. Henry did not reach out. Pauline, too proud to be the one to break the silence, found herself waiting. Each day felt like an eternity. She would go about her daily life, working, running errands, meeting friends, but all of it felt hollow. Every time someone mentioned their partner, or a friend made a joke about love, Pauline would feel a pang in her chest. She was alone, isolated in her own thoughts, unsure of what had become of the relationship she had so carefully constructed. Then, one evening, as the sun began to set and the cool breeze of autumn crept through the open window, the phone rang. Pauline's heart skipped a beat as she saw Henry's name flash across the screen. She stared at it for a moment, unsure whether to answer, unsure whether she was ready to face whatever decision he had made. Finally, with a deep breath, she picked up the phone. "Hello." Her voice was steady, but there was a slight quiver that betrayed her nerves. "Pauline," Henry's voice came through, hesitant but unmistakably familiar. "We need to talk." Her stomach tightened at his words. "We do. I'm listening." There was a long pause on the other end. She could hear him taking a deep breath, as if trying to gather the courage to speak. Finally, he spoke. "I've thought about what you said, and I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I can leave her. I don't know if I can tear my family apart like that. I wish I could, but I can't." Pauline's heart sank, the weight of his words crashing down on her. She had known this was a possibility, but hearing him say it out loud felt like a knife to her chest. He had chosen his family. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. Pauline felt a coldness settle in her chest, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. She had wanted him to choose her, to fight for her. But now, she realized that she had underestimated just how deeply his ties to his family ran. She had demanded a choice, but the truth was, she wasn't ready to accept the consequences of that choice. "Okay," Pauline said finally, her voice soft, though she could hear the tremor of emotion in it. "I understand." But as she hung up the phone, she knew that understanding wouldn't erase the pain. She had forced Henry's hand, but the reality of his decision, his choice to remain with his family, had only deepened the wound. She had tried to take control, to force him to make a decision, but in the end, she had learned a hard truth. Sometimes, the things we want most are the things we cannot have. This expanded section explores Pauline's internal adaptation to the reality of her ultimatum. Her growing realization of the complexity of Henry's life, the uncertainty about her own desires, and the emotional consequences of her choices all come into focus as she faces the fallout of her actions. The tension builds toward her confrontation with the truth and the eventual realization that she may not get what she wanted, or what she thought she needed. The weight of Henry's words hung heavy in the air. The conversation had ended, but the aftermath lingered like smoke, suffocating everything in its path. Henry had chosen his family. He had chosen the life he had built, the children he had raised, the stability he had fought for. And Pauline had never truly understood just how much that choice would hurt until the moment he said it aloud. But then, something unexpected happened. 2 days later, Henry called her again. This time, his voice was different, hesitant, quieter, but with a sense of finality that made her heart race. The words were slow, as if he was carefully choosing them, unsure of the exact impact they would have on her. When he finally spoke, his confession left her breathless. "I can't do it, Pauline. I thought I could, but I can't walk away from my family," he said softly. "But I've been thinking, maybe I should have left her. I should have done it before, when you asked. I regret it. I regret not choosing you." Pauline's heart leapt in her chest, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Was this it? Had she finally won? Her breath caught as the hope she had buried so deep began to resurface. She wanted to scream, to shout, to tell him she was finally ready to accept whatever came next. But she couldn't find the words. She just stood there, her phone pressed tightly to her ear, listening to his voice crackling through the static, uncertain yet resolute. "I'll leave her, Pauline. I'm going to do it. I'll make the decision now." "I can't keep living like this," Henry said, as if the decision had been made long before, but it was only now that he was able to say it aloud. "I'll do whatever it takes." The words felt like a dagger to her chest. They were everything she had ever wanted to hear. The years of waiting, the endless nights spent wondering when he would finally choose her, all of it was about to be validated. She could feel the walls of her life shifting, crumbling, as if the foundation that had held her up for so long was finally being dismantled. In that moment, a part of her wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this was the moment she had been waiting for. He was finally going to leave his wife. He was going to choose her. Pauline stood still for what felt like an eternity, her emotions swirling in a tangled mess of excitement, anxiety, and disbelief. She had won, hadn't she? This was the culmination of everything she had worked for, the final moment that would validate all the sacrifices she had made for this forbidden love. And yet, something inside her began to shift. The reality of Henry's words, his commitment to leave his family, felt suddenly hollow. Something didn't feel right. It should have felt like triumph, but instead, it felt like a trap. "What does that mean for us, Henry?" Pauline's voice shook as she asked the question she had been afraid to utter. She had pushed him for this moment, but now that it had arrived, she realized how little she had truly prepared herself for it. She had spent years dreaming of this very moment, But now that it was here, she wasn't sure what it really meant. Would their relationship change? Would they be able to build a life together? Or would it all fall apart the moment the dust settled? "I don't know," he answered, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But I'm willing to try. I'll leave her. I'll move out. We'll be together, Pauline. We'll start fresh." At his words, something inside Pauline clicked. The dream she had been holding on to for so long suddenly felt tangible. She was going to have him. She was going to get everything she had ever wanted, everything she had sacrificed her dignity and self-worth for. And yet, the more she thought about it, the more she realized something else. She had no idea what would happen next. She had no idea who Henry truly was without the cloak of secrecy that had surrounded their affair. She had no idea what it would mean for their relationship once the lies were stripped away, once the fantasy of their love was replaced by the cold, hard reality of living together. But there was no turning back now. She had gotten what she wanted. Henry was leaving his wife. She had won. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. Henry moved out of his home, leaving behind the life he had spent years building. Pauline couldn't believe it was happening. She watched as he packed his things, made arrangements for his children, and finally severed the ties that had bound him to his family. It was as if everything she had ever wanted was unfolding before her eyes. She had thought that this moment would be liberating, freeing her from the burden of waiting. Instead, she felt trapped. The excitement of his decision gave way to a deep, gnawing fear. She could sense that something had changed in him. There was a coldness to his actions, a reluctance in his touch, as though he wasn't entirely sure about what he was doing. In the quiet moments, when they were alone together, Pauline found herself questioning everything that had led to this point. She had pushed so hard for him to leave his wife, to choose her, and now that he had done it, she wondered if he would ever truly be hers. Would he ever be able to fully give up the life he had built? Would he ever be able to escape the bonds of his children, the home he had known for so long? When they were finally alone together in her apartment, Pauline realized just how much had changed. They no longer had the secrecy of their affair to bind them. There was no longer the excitement of stolen moments, the thrill of being together in secret. Instead, there was a cold reality that neither of them had prepared for. The apartment that had once been her sanctuary felt suffocating now, the walls closing in around them. It was as though their entire relationship had been built on the illusion of what it could be, and now that the fantasy was gone, there was nothing left but a quiet, unsettling truth. Henry was different now. He no longer looked at her with the same longing, the same desperation that he had when they had first started their affair. There was a distance between them, an invisible wall that neither of them knew how to break down. He had given her what she wanted, but the reality of living with him, of being the woman he had chosen, felt hollow. The love they had shared in the shadows, those stolen moments in hotel rooms, the secret texts, the whispered promises, now felt cheap and fleeting. "I'm sorry, Pauline," Henry said one night, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought this would be easier. I thought once I left her, everything would fall into place. But I'm not sure I'm ready for this. I don't know if I'm ready for us." The words hit Pauline like a slap to the face. This wasn't the victory she had imagined. This wasn't the dream she had fought for. Henry was there, physically present, but emotionally distant. The weight of his decision to leave his family hung over them both, but there was no escaping the truth. He had made his choice, but it wasn't the answer Pauline had expected. She had spent years hoping for this moment, only to realize that getting what she wanted had come at a far greater cost than she had ever anticipated. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between them only grew. Pauline couldn't ignore the growing doubts that festered in her mind. She had gotten what she wanted, but at what cost? Henry was no longer the man she had fallen in love with. He was a man broken by the consequences of his actions, a man who had left his family and his life behind, but who wasn't sure if he could fully embrace the new life he had chosen with her. The weight of their past, of the lies, the manipulation, the guilt, hung between them, a constant reminder of what they had done. The truth began to dawn on Pauline. She had spent so long fighting for a future with Henry that she had failed to see the cracks in their relationship, the flaws that had always been there. Now that they were finally together, the pieces didn't fit. The reality of being with Henry was nothing like the dream she had built in her mind. And she couldn't help but wonder, was this what she really wanted? Or had she been chasing a fantasy all along? The first few weeks of Henry's move into her apartment felt like a dream. For a while, Pauline allowed herself to believe that their new life together could somehow be a fairy tale, something she had earned after years of secret longing. She had gotten everything she had ever asked for. Henry had left his wife, his children, and the life he had known for so long. He was finally hers, completely and entirely. Or so she had convinced herself. But as the days wore on, the cracks in the veneer of their relationship began to show. Henry, once a man full of promises and passion, seemed more distant than ever. He spent more time on the phone, often speaking in hushed tones, his words heavy with something Pauline could never fully decipher. At night, he would lie next to her, but his body seemed to be miles away. The touch she had once craved felt cold, distant. His affection had turned into something obligatory, as though he were simply going through the motions, trying to fulfill a role that no longer fit him. Pauline, for all the excitement she had felt at first, found herself increasingly isolated. The conversations they had shared during the early days of their affair, the ones where they whispered promises and fantasies of a life together, had dried up. Now, the silence between them was deafening. What was once passionate intimacy had been replaced with awkward, strained encounters. The connection they once shared had withered, and what remained was an uncomfortable emptiness. Her mind, once so sure of herself, now raced with doubt and insecurity. She had spent so long pushing Henry to leave his family, to choose her, to make her the center of his world. But now that he was there, now that he had left everything behind, Pauline began to question whether she truly wanted him at all, or whether she had simply wanted the validation that came with getting what she thought she deserved. What had once felt like victory now seemed like a cage, and every time she looked at him, she saw the man who had betrayed his own family and, in doing so, had lost a part of himself. The loneliness that had gnawed at her before was now amplified. She found herself wandering through their apartment late at night, unable to sleep, her thoughts spiraling in dark circles. What was she supposed to do with this life that had been built on broken promises and unfulfilled dreams? She had spent so long fighting for this moment, and now that it was here, she couldn't escape the crushing weight of what it had cost her and what it was still costing her. In her quieter moments, Pauline wondered if she had made the right choice. Was it really Henry that she had wanted, or had it always been the idea of him, the fantasy of what their life together could be? She had been so fixated on the dream of having him all to herself that she had never stopped to question whether he could ever be the man she had imagined. Now, as she looked at him from across the room, she realized just how little she truly knew about him, and even more terrifying, how little he knew about her. The more she thought about it, the more Pauline realized that their relationship was not built on love or trust, but on desperation. It had been formed in the shadows, shaped by the thrill of the forbidden. What had been a stolen romance, a passionate affair, was now an ordinary relationship with none of the excitement or mystery that had once fueled their connection. And that, perhaps, was the most painful truth of all. She had spent so many years chasing a version of love that was never real, and now that she had finally captured it, she was left with the hollow feeling of unfulfilled longing. As the weeks stretched on, Pauline began to notice how Henry had started to withdraw even more. He would spend hours on his laptop, his face absorbed in work, and when he wasn't working, he was lost in his own thoughts, retreating into a shell that Pauline couldn't crack. The intimacy between them, once so palpable, had all but disappeared. What had once been a torrid affair filled with fire and passion was now a sterile existence, where each word was laced with unspoken frustration and regret. One evening, as the sun set outside the apartment window, Pauline watched Henry sitting on the couch, his fingers absently scrolling through his phone. There was a strange emptiness in the way he held it, as if he was looking for something but wasn't sure what. Pauline felt an undeniable pang of jealousy, a gnawing feeling in her gut that told her something wasn't right. She couldn't help but ask, "Who are you talking to?" she asked softly, trying to keep the edge of suspicion out of her voice. But it was impossible to mask the concern she felt. Henry's eyes flickered over to her briefly before returning to the screen. "Work stuff," he mumbled. Pauline's heart clenched. "Work stuff? You're always working now." She sat beside him, placing a hand on his knee, hoping for a moment of connection, but he flinched, pulling away slightly. It was subtle, but it was enough to send a cold wave of dread through her. He didn't meet her eyes. "I've got a lot on my plate, Pauline. You know that." Her heart sank. She had expected him to apologize, to take her hand and reassure her, but instead, he seemed to be pulling away even further. It was as though the more she needed him, the further he distanced himself. The loneliness that had plagued her for so long was now unbearable, and it was compounded by the fact that she had never felt more alone than she did in Henry's presence. They had everything, each other, the future they had dreamed of, but somehow, it wasn't enough. "What do you want from me?" Pauline asked, her voice trembling with frustration. The words slipped out before she could stop them, but once they were out, there was no taking them back. Henry finally looked at her, his expression distant, his brow furrowed. "I don't know anymore, Pauline." His words hung in the air like a death sentence. The moment of hope, the victory she had once savored, had turned into a nightmare. She had asked for everything, but in doing so, she had asked for something neither of them were prepared for. She had wanted him to leave his family, to abandon everything for her, but now that he had done it, she realized that the man who had chosen her was not the man she thought he was. He was a man shattered by his own guilt, a man trapped in a life he never truly wanted. And the worst part was that Pauline had played a role in that destruction. The phone calls with his family, the strained conversations, the awkward silences, they all began to take their toll on both of them. Pauline couldn't help but listen in on the conversations he had with his children, hearing the sorrow in their voices, the confusion in their words. She knew that, despite his promises to her, Henry was still deeply tied to his family, and the emotional cost of leaving them behind had begun to consume him. One night, after another quiet dinner that was filled with unspoken tension, Henry broke down. He sat on the edge of the bed, his face in his hands, his voice cracking as he spoke. "I can't do this anymore, Pauline. I thought I could, but I can't. I made a mistake. I shouldn't have left her. I shouldn't have left them." Pauline stared at him, her chest tightening with a mixture of anger and despair. She had spent so long wishing for this moment, for him to choose her, and now that he had, it was clear that it had come at a cost neither of them had fully understood. "You promised me, Henry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You promised you would leave them for me, that we would be together. But now it feels like I've lost everything." In that moment, Pauline realized the depth of her own betrayal. She had pushed him to this point, but in doing so, she had destroyed the very foundation of what they could have been. She had won, yes, but it had been a hollow victory, and the price was far higher than she had ever anticipated. The silence in the apartment was deafening. The furniture, once filled with laughter and whispered promises, now stood as silent witnesses to the unraveling of a life she had so desperately tried to hold together. Pauline had spent months building a life with Henry, believing that she was finally free of the shackles of her past, free from the pain of being the other woman, free from the suffocating loneliness that had defined much of her existence. Yet, in the end, it all felt like a hollow, brittle shell that had cracked under the weight of reality. It was early morning when she packed her things, the sun barely breaking through the curtains, casting a pale, cold light over the apartment. Pauline moved with a sense of purpose, but there was no joy in it, only resignation. Henry was still in the bedroom, his face buried in the pillow, as if sleep could provide the answers he so desperately sought. He had asked her, begged her to stay just a few days ago. He had told her that they could make it work, that the love they shared was worth fighting for, that they could rebuild what had been broken. But Pauline knew better now. She had seen enough, felt enough, to understand that what they had was nothing more than an illusion, built on lies and the crumbling ruins of their past mistakes. She had returned to the apartment after that final confrontation with Henry, the one where he admitted that he was no longer sure of his place in her life. The guilt that had lingered in his eyes, guilt for betraying his family, for betraying himself, had been too much for her to ignore. Pauline had spent so long chasing after something she thought she wanted, but now she was left with nothing but the bitter taste of regret. Henry was not the man she had imagined, and the love they shared was not the kind of love that could survive in the cold, harsh light of reality. As she packed, Pauline couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her here. She had always thought she was strong, that she could get what she wanted if she just fought hard enough. She had pushed Henry to leave his wife, manipulated him with promises of a future together, and driven him to abandon everything he had known for her. And when he finally did, when he gave her what she had asked for, she realized that the victory wasn't sweet at all. It was bitter, poisoned by the lies and manipulations that had brought them together. Her relationship with Henry had started in secrecy, in stolen moments of passion that had felt like freedom. But the secrecy had also been its poison. She had convinced herself that if they could only be together, if only they could build a life without the constraints of guilt and deception, everything would be perfect. But what she hadn't understood was that Henry was not just a man who had betrayed his family, he was a man who had betrayed himself. And in trying to rebuild him into the person she had hoped he could be, she had neglected to see the cracks in herself. Pauline had always seen herself as the victim in their relationship. She had convinced herself that she was entitled to happiness, that her love for Henry had been enough to justify her actions. But now, as she stood in the midst of the ruins of their life together, she couldn't deny the truth any longer. She had been just as much a part of the destruction as Henry had been. She had allowed herself to be consumed by the need for validation, for a love that could never be fully hers. She had sacrificed her own sense of self in the process, convincing herself that love was worth any price, even if that price was her own happiness. It wasn't until Henry had left, until he had walked out of the apartment for the last time, that Pauline understood what had truly been missing from her life: herself. In the end, she had given up everything for a man who could never truly give her what she wanted. And in doing so, she had lost sight of who she was. The moment Henry had left, something inside Pauline shifted. She didn't feel relief or joy, but a quiet, sobering realization that she was free for the first time in years. Free from the suffocating weight of their toxic relationship, free from the lies, the manipulations, the unspoken promises that had kept her tethered to a man who was never fully hers. She was free to face the truth about herself, about what she had done, and about what she truly wanted in life. In the days that followed, Pauline slowly began to rebuild her life. It wasn't easy. There were moments of overwhelming sadness, moments when she wondered if she would ever be able to truly move on from Henry, from the life they had shared. But with each passing day, she grew stronger. She began to realize that she had spent so much of her life chasing after someone else's version of happiness, someone else's version of love, that she had neglected her own needs, her own dreams. She had placed her worth in the hands of a man who had never been able to truly see her, and in doing so, she had lost herself. Pauline began to focus on herself in ways she never had before. She reconnected with old friends, people who had always been there for her, but whom she had pushed away during her time with Henry. She enrolled in art classes, something she had always wanted to do, but had never allowed herself the time for. She began to explore her own passions, her own desires, without the shadow of Henry's expectations looming over her. Slowly but surely, she began to rediscover the person she had been before the affair, before the lies, before the manipulation. It wasn't easy to let go of the dream of Henry, to let go of the fantasy that had once seemed so real. But Pauline realized that the life she had dreamed of with him was just that, a dream, a fantasy that had been built on the ruins of everyone's lives, including her own. She had sacrificed so much in the pursuit of that dream, and now that it had shattered, she was left with the painful but necessary task of rebuilding her own life. And as hard as it was, she knew it was the only way forward. She started therapy, seeking help to understand why she had allowed herself to fall into the trap of a toxic relationship, why she had allowed herself to become so lost in the pursuit of someone else's happiness. Through therapy, she began to understand that her need for validation had stemmed from deep-seated insecurities, from a fear of being alone, from a belief that she was not worthy of love unless it came from someone else. But she was slowly learning that love didn't need to come from someone else. It needed to come from herself. As the months passed, Pauline found herself growing more comfortable in her own skin. The pain of the past began to fade, and in its place, she found a sense of peace. She was no longer the woman who had allowed herself to be defined by her relationship with Henry, no longer the woman who had fought for a love that had never truly belonged to her. She was someone new, someone stronger, someone more self-assured, someone who knew that her worth was not determined by anyone else's choices or actions. One evening, while sitting in a cafe, Pauline caught a glimpse of herself in the reflection of the window. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She looked older, more worn, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She wasn't the same person who had been obsessed with the idea of Henry and the life they might have had together. She had faced the truth about her choices, about her own desires, and in doing so, she had learned to love herself, not because of who she was with, but because of who she had become on her own. For the first time in a long time, Pauline felt at peace. She had returned to herself, to the person she had been before Henry, before the affair, before the lies. She had learned the hard way that love was not about possession, about controlling someone's choices, about forcing a life that wasn't meant to be. Love, she realized, was about freedom, about mutual respect, about allowing both people to be their true selves. She had given up that freedom once, but now she was reclaiming it for herself. As Pauline walked out of the cafe, the evening sun setting behind her, she felt a quiet sense of optimism about the future. She wasn't sure where her life was headed, but for the first time, she was excited to find out. She had learned the most important lesson of all. She didn't need anyone else to define who she was. She was enough just as she was.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.